Dr. Johann Bass is a musicologist whose scholarship ranges from the performance history of early music to the aesthetics and reception history of black music between the United States and urban centers in Africa. He is the co-author of Shout Because You're Free, the ring shout tradition in coastal Georgia. He currently teaches at Wheaton College. Dr. Colin Holman maintains an active professional career in Chicago, where he divides his energies between conducting and musicology. His extensive conducting credits include work in opera and musical theater, with orchestras and concert bands, and in early music. He is currently the director of Symphony Orchestra and a lecturer of music history at Loyola University. Dr. Sarah Holman has performed with Opera Southwest, Lyric Opera Cleveland, Chicago Chamber Opera, and many others. She was a featured presenter at the International Congress of Voice Teachers 2017 conference in Stockholm, Sweden, and serves on the Nats Foundation Board. Dr. Holman is a professor of voice and serves as director of opera at Wheaton College Conservatory. Karen Redekop Edwards performs as a soloist and as guest artist with orchestras in both Canada and the United States. As a collaborative artist, Dr. Edwards has recorded several CDs, performed on Live from WFMT, toured South Africa, Israel, Europe, England, Canada, and the United States.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation, An African, an Englishman, and a voice teacher walk into a bar. Art music as a reconfiguration of gentility to activist pride. Long before the tide of our current cultural moment, the four of us have been intrigued by the intersections of our professional and personal lives. Johann Bass, Colin Holman, and pianist Karen Edwards are intimately familiar with the lingering gentility of Victorian England, albeit each from their own gaze and continent, Africa, England, and Canada in North America. I, as an American singer, voice teacher, have learned a great deal about art music, gentility, and activist pride from each one of them. Art music reconfigured each of us and brought about the intersection of our lives that compelled us toward this presentation. Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, an exemplar of British gentility, seemed an obvious figure, and the African-American-England triad, irresistible. When focused on the beginning collaborations of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor's music with poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, one can see a path that was laid that led to an entire generation of artistic activism and pride. It led all the way to the Harlem Renaissance, and beyond that, even into today. Colin Holman will connect Coleridge-Taylor's English heritage with his American influence. Johann Bass will explore the cultural context of Black American concert music and Samuel Coleridge-Taylor's significance in that context. Karen Edwards and I will perform the seminal collaborations of Dunbar and Coleridge-Taylor in A Corn Song, 3 of the African romances, and conclude with an elegant setting of Dunbar's poem, The Poet and His Song, set by Florence B. Price, an esteemed composer in the lineage of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor. Dr. Holman?
We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be otherwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see thus while we wear the mask. We smile, but, O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. On the surface, these words by Paul Laurence Dunbar from his Lyrics of Lowly Life seem literally so very timely. But underneath, there is so much cultural tension in this poem. A mask that hides the suffering of its wearer while presenting a more joyful face to the world. It is precisely this contrast that our presentation today revolves around. The extraordinary life of Dunbar's close contemporary, the violinist, composer, and conductor, Samuel Coleridge-Taylor. Born in London in 1875, he was the illegitimate child of Dr. Daniel Hugh Taylor, a native of Sierra Leone, and Alice Hare Martin, an Englishwoman and medical student at King's College Hospital, where they presumably met. Daniel Taylor returned to Africa not knowing that Alice was pregnant. There is confusion, perhaps deliberate, about Coleridge-Taylor's upbringing, but recent genealogy studies tell us that a couple by the name of Sarah and Benjamin Holman provided financial support for the single mother and son. And how could I not resist to share this with you? Benjamin Holman gave Samuel his first violin, along with his first violin lessons, and the family moved to the southwest London suburb of Croydon. Samuel was surrounded by a contrasting atmosphere of Victorian gentility amid racial pressure, of which he spoke publicly later in life with immense dignity and grace. He sang in local church choirs, studied the violin, and won an open scholarship to the Royal College of Music to study with Charles Villiers Stanford. This was an incredible achievement for someone who had both admirers and racial critics. Samuel's music was published by Novello, one of the most respectable music companies of the last 200 years. He won the Royal College of Music Composition Prize twice, became close friends with England's leading composers of his day, who included Holst, Vaughan Williams, and Elgar, and was socially accepted through his artistic identity and integrity. These relationships led to his first commission on Elgar's recommendation from the Three Choirs Festival, a nearly 200-year-long running festival supported by the cathedral cities of Hereford, Worcester, and Gloucester. Coleridge-Taylor wrote a short orchestral work for this commission, the Ballade in A minor, which is English in character, yet not without a nod to Grieg and Dvorak, thereby contributing symphonic music to his output in choral and chamber music, piano music, and songs, leading to incidental music for a series of London plays, and especially his cantatas, such as the Hiawatha Trilogy. His international reputation as a composer was definitely established. Shortly thereafter, Samuel was appointed Professor of Composition at Trinity College of Music in London in 1903, and at the Guildhall School of Music in 1910, two of England's finest music schools. He also conducted throughout the United Kingdom, from amateur orchestras of provincial Britain to the renowned Halle Orchestra. The biographical stature of Coleridge-Taylor is, therefore, unquestioned. A thoroughly professional series of accomplishments, and all before he was 30 years old. This would be an extraordinary life story for anyone, but especially for someone with a father from Sierra Leone in late Victorian and Edwardian England. Unlike the often unbridled nationalism of his contemporaries, reveling in the new English Renaissance of music, Coleridge-Taylor focused much of his artistic effort in the realm of exoticism, in congruence with a number of his contemporaries, such as Rimsky-Korsakov's opera Sadko, Saint-Saëns' Samson et Dalila, Verdi's Aida, or Sullivan's The Mikado. Perhaps this was a means of escapism from the rather jingoistic mood of the British at the time, as well as a mode of inquiry exploring his own personal background. Coleridge-Taylor set texts to music of many typical themes drawn from the historical, literary, romantic, light-hearted, and dramatic, and especially the exotic, such as those of the United States, Africa, Haiti, Japan, and China. But Coleridge-Taylor went far further than his English contemporaries, for certain, certainly further than Elgar's Crown of India, and further than the dabbling exotic examples of his teacher, Villiers Stanford. He drew upon poets, including Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was respected and read by Villiers Stanford and Elgar, for inspiration in his best-known cantatas, ballet and choral ballads, and also Walt Whitman, who was to exert probably the largest literary influence on 20th century British and American composers. Other poetic sources don't surprise us. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, after whom Coleridge-Taylor was named, Shakespeare, Browning, Rossetti, and Wordsworth, but also Heinrich Heine, Hans Christian Andersen, and especially also Paul Laurence Dunbar, who became one of the first influential Black poets in American literature and whose poetry I quoted at the outset. Dunbar's meeting with Samuel and the series of recitals they undertook were life-changing, not only for their lives, but for ours. And as we will shortly hear, through music of social change and through the collaborations of future artists that comprise the Harlem Renaissance. There are many interesting parallels between Dunbar and Coleridge-Taylor. Almost exact contemporaries, international reputations as Black artists, representing the artistic culture of turn of the century Britain and the United States, mastery of technique in their fields, providing perspectives on their race, writing sympathetically, aspiringly, and artistically at the forefront of their professions, and living tragically short lives. On the strength of his poetic acclaim, Dunbar, with Lyrics of Lonely Life, commenced a 6-month reading tour of England. There he found publishers for a British collection of his edition, and in 1897 befriended musician Samuel Coleridge-Taylor. After meeting, they collaborated on a song collection, the Opus 17, 7 African Romances, light, tuneful pieces, but with very little actual African content, and an opera, the Opus 25, Dream Lovers, the story of a Moroccan prince and his friend finding true happiness with 2 sisters. 2 years later, Coleridge-Taylor heard concerts in London given by the Fisk Jubilee Singers, which left an indelible impression, especially because racial challenges encountered by Samuel caused him to consider moving to the United States, where he was to be openly and warmly welcomed. Even just the simple act, he writes, of walking down the streets of Croydon could be hard. Yet on the podium, his artistry brought only respect and openness. This was beautifully encapsulated and memorialized on his gravestone. Quote, "He lives while music lives, too young to die. His great simplicity, his happy courage in an alien world, his gentleness made all that knew him love him." Coleridge-Taylor traveled 3 times to the United States in 1904, 1906, and 1910, where he was honored by an invitation from the Coleridge-Taylor Choral Society of Washington, D.C., founded in 1901 by Black choral singers, who sponsored his first US visit, and he conducted them at a concert in Constitution Hall. I find it incredible that his name would be taken by 200 African-American singers before they had even met, merely based on reputation. Coleridge-Taylor was also received by the White House, President Theodore Roosevelt, and conducted by the president's own band. A remarkable honor to this day when civilians are still typically not permitted on the podium of this group. This transatlantic relationship brought together a successful Black British composer of status with Black American music lovers. Coleridge-Taylor's reputation today still largely rests on his cantatas, but his third visit to the United States and to the New York Philharmonic, who were conducted by Gustav Mahler, earned Coleridge-Taylor the label the African Marla by the players of the orchestra. As a return gift, Coleridge-Taylor composed the Bambula Rhapsodic Dance, Opus 75. This accolade was not a reflection of his work in the fields of symphony and symphonic song, of course, because Coleridge-Taylor's output included only one symphony, symphonic variations, and some orchestral character pieces. But this title was a tremendous mark of respect, since Marla was considered the leading composer of symphonic music and symphonic song following Dvorak's death in Coleridge-Taylor's lifetime, and in the Western musical world, placing Coleridge-Taylor as it did not just equal to, but most certainly above other English symphonists, Elgar, Parry, and Vaughan Williams. From an entirely historical perspective, I think this all makes Coleridge-Taylor the most important composer of color since Chevalier de Saint-Georges. No other composer of this personal heritage had corresponding influence and respect, and no other composer had this position in society, a transatlantic reputation, music published by one of the world's leading publishers, head of 2 national schools of music simultaneously. An amazing accomplishment when there weren't any Black Americans in positions of music leadership at American colleges and universities until George Walker's contributions in the 1970s. 2 other Black American musicians did have some intermediary influence of significance in the second half of the 19th century. The Philadelphian band composer Francis B. Johnson and the pianist and composer blind Tom Wiggins, who was the first Black American musician to play in the White House. Coleridge-Taylor's influence still spread considerably further and wider. Longfellow's popular poem, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast from 1893, was set by Coleridge-Taylor as a cantata, and somewhat in contrasting style, since much of the typical British choral repertoire of the time lent heavily on the oratorio tradition. The music is light, melodious, and without complication, but it met the need for new choral music at a time when amateur choirs were popular and well supported. Coleridge-Taylor composed 2 sequels, The Death of Minnehaha, 1899, and Hiawatha's Departure, 1900. This trilogy became his most popular set of pieces, works I sang as a teenager in an attempt to rekindle both the music and tradition of annual performances, but music I confess that I could not fully appreciate, having not read Longfellow, having not been to the United States, and not having any real life and deep experience in racial or cross-cultural issues. I think my gaze was likely just as provincial as many of those who heard and sang those early performances. Scenes from Hiawatha was performed almost every year from 1899 to 1959 at the Henry Wood Promenade Concerts, including 2 first night performances during Coleridge-Taylor's life and 1 prestigious last night performance. And despite the flamboyant conductor Sir Malcolm Sargent's attempt to resurrect them during the 1930s with a series of Hiawatha ballets, they receive fewer performances today, I think, because of the gradual decline of the amateur choral society. But clearly these were personal works for Coleridge-Taylor. Hiawatha's Wedding Feast received over 200 performances in the first 6 years, and Coleridge-Taylor named his son Hiawatha, born in 1900. Coleridge-Taylor's sustained presence in the British concert scene included 7 proms performances of the Ballade in A minor during his lifetime, and almost every year until 1930, as well as proms performances of Bambula almost every year until 1934. Many of his songs were also featured at the proms, even with the occasional premiere tucked between operatic favorites or Friday night English reminiscences that followed mighty Wagnerian tributes. These seem strange musical bedfellows. After the Second World War, Coleridge-Taylor's music almost completely lost traction in British concert repertoire. But now that the Englishman has walked into the bar, you would surely expect him to be the first. I pass the baton to Johann Bass, who will share his perspective for today's presentation. Dr. Bass.
Thank you. Art music Gentility and Activism. Joseph Horowitz, writing in The American Scholar, September 13th, 2019, posed a provocative question. Why has American classical music ignored its Black past? Pointing to Antonin Dvorak, Horowitz calls the Czech composer, quote, the immigrant composer who predicted a different future, end of quote. He went on to posit the central historical fact, quote, at one point in the last century, classical music was on the cusp of a revolution. The Englishman, Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, was writing works like his 24 Negro melodies. Dvorak's own assistant, Harry Burleigh, was reimagining Black spirituals for the concert stage that would be performed by the likes of Marian Anderson. And the lineage continued with William Grant Still, Nathaniel Dett, Florence Price, and Margaret Bonds. The arrival in 1934 of William Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony seemed to usher in the imminent fulfillment of Dvorak's prophecy, end of quote. Coleridge-Taylor bridged the gap, as was said, standing on the cusp of a revolution. During the last 2 decades of the 19th century. This was the moment when Dvorak lived in New York and visited the Midwest in 1893. Coleridge-Taylor's first visit to the United States in 1904 came sometime after the Black American music community had embraced him already. Coleridge-Taylor, like his Black American music colleagues, created an imagined conception of Africa, valorized as an exotic ancestral home, not based on experience. This image was an Africa constructed in the imagination only as an imagined abode. This view counteracted the prevailing scientific trends of evolutionary narratives, such as the cranial measurement argument, central to anthropological studies at the time. The prevailing scientific discussions placed Africans below races from Europe. On the evolutionary scale that ranged from bipeds on the lowest end to the scale of Africans to Caucasians who occupied the pinnacle of the evolutionary scale, the argument went. The Back to Africa movement that repatriated many African Americans under President Monroe into Liberia during the first half of the 19th century anticipated the later scramble for Africa that resulted in the colonization of African countries primarily by Britain and France. Indeed, the Victorian and Edwardian eras in which Coleridge-Taylor lived made it possible for his Sierra Leonean father to study medicine in the United Kingdom. Britain's colonial prowess and its maritime power justifiably boasted that Britannia ruled the waves. Into this scene of maritime trade and travel during the last quarter of the 19th century entered the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who sang mostly Black spirituals from the United States, who impressed Coleridge-Taylor immensely. The gentility of the British domestic sphere, benefiting from African trade, ranged from plumes for Victorian hats to a chocolate dessert craze at the time. The presence of Africa was evident through the trading with faraway African colonies, brought Samuel Coleridge-Taylor to the United States as an unwitting activist for the Black American cause of social uplift. Coleridge-Taylor enjoyed the full rights and privileges of an upper-class Englishman of musical genius and professional leadership in music, without having been regarded as a slave descendant. The pernicious, degrading stereotypes of enslaved African Americans during the 19th century manifested themselves in the most popular theater entertainment of the day in the US, blackface minstrelsy. The demeaning stock character of the good-for-nothing, lazy Sambo on the one hand, and the clumsy, pretentious dandy called Zip Coon on the other hand, presented two opposite arguments against emancipation of the enslaved Americans. The lazy Sambo was a caricature of a fictional character. Enslaved, hard-working field hands could not have been lazy good-for-nothings. How else could they have garnered wealth for the plantation owner? Conversely, the Zip Coon character, a fictionalized, freed enslaved person, would be a misfit in a free society, the stereotype predicted. The Zip Coon, in the minstrelsy context, avoided speaking in dialect. Rather, in his clumsy verbosity and misused highfalutin language, he became an object of derision. Right into the midst of these pejorative stereotypes, Paul Laurence Dunbar used dialect speech in the refrain of Corn Song to elevate the humble dignity of the enslaved person. Rather than ridicule enslaved dialect speech, as was done in blackface minstrelsy, the refrain is the persistent reminder of beauty and African cultural memory, as well as an authenticity of the enslaved human's spirit that the listener is reminded to listen for repeatedly.
In his 2011 work, Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, A Musical Life, historian Jeffrey Green recounts the 1897 meeting of Paul Laurence Dunbar and Samuel Coleridge-Taylor. They were at a garden party in England being hosted by Henry Downing when the landlady brought Samuel Coleridge-Taylor to the garden. He was in his final weeks as an undergraduate at the Royal College of Music and was seeking a collaboration with Dunbar. A joint recital of their work together was later arranged by Downing, attended by other African Americans, and marked the composer's first known collaboration with another person of African descent. A corn song was on that program. The setting allowed room for the poet, the composer, continental perspective, and audience. As Zimbabwe poet and scholar Tsitsi Jaji describes it in her article, Art Song Poetics, the collaboration offered a rich dialogic reflection on the pleasures and paradoxes of musical performance, production, and consumption. In her analysis of the piece, Jaji continues, and I quote, "Their cross-cultural, transnational exchanges as African-American and Afro-British thinkers at the end of the 19th century are recorded in imaginative, sometimes counterintuitive musical hearings of the text. The vernacular voice in Coleridge-Taylor's musical settings of portions of the poem that are in dialect imagine black sound in ways that reference spirituals he had heard performed, but his sonic archive is principally British rather than American."
Still the spirits brave and strong find a comforter in song, and their good song rises ever loud and cheery. Oh, we hold a consent to the master in his seat comes the burden full and sweet of the mellow minor music growing clearer as the toilers raise the hymn through the silence dusk and dim to the cabin's restful shelter drawing near. Oh, we hold a consent early morn, not a sinking sun says the day is done. And a tear is in the eye of the master sitting by, as he listens to the echoes, the reviving, to the music's fading calls, as he fades away and falls into silence. Deep within the cabin oh, we hold a consent early morn, not a sinking sun says the day is
Back to you, Dr. Bass.
Two countries divided by enslavement in a common language. The central fact that the United Kingdom never had enslaved Africans in large numbers working on the British Isles marked Coleridge-Taylor's life as particular. Walking down the street to be noticeably different from most English people only in appearance, but not in social standing, was the extent of his discrimination. Afforded the best tuition as a child and then as a rising star during his post-secondary training in music, his musical advancement encountered no obstacles of discrimination in the United Kingdom, as was customary in the United States. The United Kingdom deposited their enslaved persons in their colonies, not on the British Isles. The United States did the reverse.
Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, entangled in the influence of the exotic, popular at the time, and his own personal efforts to express his African identity, sought out further collaborations with Dunbar. African Romances, a collection of 7 songs from the poetry of Lyrics of a Lowly Life by Dunbar, were the result. The title, African Romances, and the first song of the set, an African love song, give a nod to the African influence. The 3 center songs, A Prayer, Starry Night, and Dawn, are shorter poems that engage the imagination of the African American spiritual experience without giving any reference to the stereotypical spiritual. They are securely embedded within the English Victorian art song tradition, and we'll hear those now.
I talk to the
Back to you, Dr. Bates.
Coleridge-Taylor, an Englishman, embraced an African-American role model. As was previously pointed out, Coleridge-Taylor was honored by an invitation from the Coleridge-Taylor Choral Society of Washington, D.C., founded in 1901, 3 years before his first visit to the United States. The highlight of this first visit was Coleridge-Taylor conducting his sponsoring organization in the Constitution Hall. On that occasion, the program included his setting of Longfellow's poem, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast of 1893. So popular was this extended poem that Dvorak likely read the work in Czech translation as a young person before he even came to the United States. Musicologist Michael Beckerman pointed to references of this poem as depictions in Dvorak's final symphony, his Symphony Number 9, nicknamed From the New World. The importance of Coleridge-Taylor's first visit to the United States cannot be underestimated. He was proof positive that Dvorak's prediction was possible. He was a Black composer who could write choral and symphonic works using the folklore of the United States. He came to the United States as an Englishman, not a member of a Black community of English persons in the United Kingdom. Coleridge-Taylor was embraced by Black concert musicians experiencing the first few decades during the rise of Jim Crow, the period 1877 to 1965. This period of intensifying law-enforced racial segregation formed a counterbalance to the spirit of uplift among Black Americans. Coleridge-Taylor was the exemplar of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth. He affirmed the rise of an African-American bourgeoisie and arrived as a veritable deus ex machina to Black American musical aspirations. Coleridge-Taylor Society sprang up in major cities in the United States, all done by Black musicians in those cities. All Black composers of the next generation, from Florence Price, who composed 3 symphonies, to William Grant Still, who composed 6 symphonies, were inspired by Coleridge-Taylor. This next generation benefited from the largesse of philanthropists like Rockefeller, Rosenwald, Holstein, Harman, Wanamaker, and others, who encouraged Black concert music by awarding prizes. In 1932, Florence Price received the Wanamaker Prize for a symphony in E minor. The next year, she was honored as the first Black woman to have a symphonic work performed in the United States by a major orchestra, in this case, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Today, we will end our presentation with her art song, The Poet and His Song.
A song is just a little thing, and yet what joy it is to sing. In hours of toil it gives me zest, and when at last I long for rest, when cows come home along the bars, and
The music of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor is in the public domain, and much of it can be found online. As well, Classical Vocal Reprints has lovely editions of much of his vocal music, as well as their recent release of the 44 songs of Florence B. Price. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and goodbye.